Hello there, friends. Thank you for tuning in. Nerdy Nog Dog coming to you. Chapter 7 and 8, Decimal Review. Chapter 7, this should have been review. We were doing this while we were in class. We would take fractions like 1/5 and we would ask the question, well, how do I write 1/5 as a decimal? We know that the only last names available to us for decimals are tenths, hundredths, or thousandths, right? And that would put us 1 digit to the right of the decimal, 2 digits to the right of the decimal, or in this case, if you can see it, 3 digits to the right of the decimal. Okay, so we're looking for a last name that would work, and our options are tenths, hundredths, or thousandths. So fifth is not an option, but what we do know is we know something about equivalent fractions. And we know that a fifth can easily be made into a tenth, right? So to make that fifth a tenth, if I think about my equivalent fractions, I know I have to multiply that by 2 to make it become a tenth. So whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do to the numerator. And when I do 2 times 1, I get 2 tenths. So basically what I've said is 1/5 is equivalent to 2 tenths. Now here's the thing. Tenth is a last name I can use. I know how to write that as a decimal. It would be decimal point 2 with the last name of tenth, which means it's 1 digit to the right of the decimal. So again, this should be review, but we do need to be masterful of that and feel like we can do that. So let's try one more. If I had, say, let's say I have 2 25ths. Well, 25ths is definitely not a last name. My last names of options are tenth, hundredth, or thousandth. Guess what? A 25th can become a thousandth, but let's go easier. A 25th can become a hundredth. How do I make a 25th a hundredth? Well, think quarters, right? 25 cents is 1 quarter. So I know that a 25th can be multiplied by 4, and that's going to give me 100. So whatever I do to the denominator, I have to do the numerator, and then I end up with 8 hundredths. Well, if you can say it as a fraction, 8 hundredths, I can write it as a decimal because I know, here's my decimal spot. This first placement to the right of the decimal is tenths. The second placement is hundredths. I consider those the last name. Whoops, I should have had a D in there. Hundredths, if you can read my writing, okay? So when I read my fraction, it is 8 hundredths, which means that 8 has to go here because it needs the last name of hundredths. So what goes here? Well, a 0 placeholder. So if I were to read this decimal, it would be 8 hundredths, reading that last name, okay? Again, that should have been review. We were working on that while in class. So now to get to chapter 8, which was your homework on our independent study last week, it was how do we add and subtract decimals. So again, I can read just about any decimal because I know my place value, right? This is the ones when I'm talking whole numbers. We read the decimal as and. Then I've got my tenths, last name, my hundredths, let's see if I can spell that correctly. And then I've got thousandths. So again, if I'm thinking of my place value, here's my tens. I can add any digits to that and I should be able to read it appropriately because I'm using my place value chart. If you guys happen to have your spirals at home, if you remember from our very first chapter, I gave you a place value chart that looks just like this. So let's just throw in some numbers. 8, 7, 4. I could read this as 8. I don't need to read the last name here. The decimal point is always read as and 74, last name, hundredths. What if I add a 1 there? 8 and 741 thousandths. So again, we work on reading in 3-digit sections, right? Now what if this is 0, 0 there? 8 and 1 thousandth. Okay, so we should be able to read our decimals. We worked on that a lot, chapter 7, while we were still in class. So now, chapter 8, back to chapter 8. If I have to add decimals, the rule for adding decimals is always that you line up the decimal point. So if I had 8 and 100th plus 4/10, I would rewrite that. Let me make sure this looks like a plus sign. I would rewrite that like this as 8 and 100ths. My rule is I line up the decimal point. So they always have to be in order so that I'm still adding by place value. And then I would add those together. Now again, there's nothing in this column, but I can always think of that as a 0. You can add as many zeros after your tenths place as needed. So if that makes you feel more comfortable, add that 0 in there. And then you just add going down the place column and carry over like we would normally. So 1, 4, my decimal point stays in line, and 8. Okay, now that might look a little bit different when we're doing subtraction. So if I had something like, let's take a whole number. If I had 3 as a whole number, I don't need to write the decimal point. I could, but if there's nothing following it, there's just no reason to do that. So I'm just gonna think of the whole number, 3, and if I were to subtract 1 and 3/10 from that 3 whole number, I would want to rewrite this, okay? I would rewrite that as 3. I know that the decimal point is telling me that's a whole number there. I can add as many zeros as I want after that decimal point, okay? In this case, I only need 1 0 because what I'm subtracting only goes to the tenths place. So 3 whole number minus, I line up my decimal point, 1, there's my decimal after the 1, and 3/10. Now I subtract, just as you would subtract any of these numbers in place columns. So I cannot take 3 away from 0. However, I can borrow a 10 from this place column. That gives me 2 left over there. Carry the 1 is what we would say, and what we're actually doing is adding 10 to that place column, right? So now I actually have 10 minus 3, and then 2 minus 1. This decimal point doesn't change. So again, you guys know how to subtract and regroup. The difference is you have to take in for account of the decimal, okay? So the last part of the learning for this week is word problems. I'm going to put that on a separate video because I am limited in how long my videos can be. So Nerdy Nog Dogs, that is lesson 1 for chapter 7, 8 of decimals.